Hello everybody and welcome back to another video by Funlearn Tutorials. In today's video, we are going to be considering the Heckscher Ohlin model and how it is different from the Ricardian models. Basically the comparative advantage and the absolute advantage. So it's a revision for the Ricardian model as well. Now, what is the basic idea of the Heckscher Ohlin model? Let's start with two simple equations that will give us some idea about the model that we are discussing in the Heckscher Ohlin model. So, let us start with the price equations, right? So, let me write two equations for you and then we'll interpret how the two equations have meaning in this regard. Let's say Px is equal to W ALX plus R AKX. This is one equation that we have. So this is equation 1. And we have another equation. We have Py is equal to, what is Py equal to? Py is equal to W ALY plus R AKY. So these are the two equations. These are our two price equations. Now let's see what we can find from these two equations. Basically, the idea is that you can see these are the two sectors of the economy. So you have a X sector and you have a Y sector. And X sector uses inputs L and K. Similarly, Y sector also uses inputs L and K. So you have two sectors X and Y and you have two factors. So these are the two sectors. These are the two sectors and these are the two factors. What are the two factors? The two factors are L and K. So you can see X draws in both labor and capital, X draws in both labor and capital, and also Y also draws in both labor and capital. This is a very standard Jones 1965 type model, but that is not the issue. The issue is not how the model looks like. So I'm just going to remove all of this. I'm just here, this was just to give you an idea about how the model looks like. What is the main idea of the model? So if you think of the Jones 1965, Jones 1975 model, the motivation of reading those models was how the economy works, how the production structure in the economy works. But at the end of the day, this is an international economics chapter, right? So the thing that I mentioned, Ricardian model, should give you an idea that this Heckscher Ohlin model talks about how international trade takes place. So Heckscher Ohlin model is a model that discusses how international trade takes place. Think about the Ricardian model. Think about absolute advantage, comparative advantage. The idea was basically the difference in production structure. So you have one country, say country A, and you have another country B. You realize that the production structure in country A and the production structure in country B are not the same. The production structure in country A is such that it produces X more easily than Y. And the production structure in B, country B, is such that it produces Y more easily than X. Now, absolute advantage represented that by saying that no matter what the situation be, A always uses, there are two ways of saying, either A uses more of, A can use less factor to produce X, or given the same input, A can produce more X. The other way, the other part of the coin is B, given the same factor, can produce more Y, or it uses less resources to produce 1 unit of Y. That is, these two things say that A is better at producing X and B is better at producing Y. So you ask A to produce only X, you ask B to produce only Y, and then you ask these two countries to exchange these. For comparative advantage, the issue was no, it's not that simple. There's a comparative issue going on. So you have to think about the ratio of inputs being used, not the absolute inputs, but rather the comparative inputs being used. So that was the issue of comparative advantage. Now, what is the highlight? Let me highlight the highlighter of these two, the inequality. Inequality in what? Inequality in the production functions. So the main idea about the comparative advantage and absolute advantage was that two economies, the two countries under question, have different production functions. So the question arises is that always true? Do all countries have different production functions? So if I consider 7 countries, all the 7 countries have different production functions. Heckscher Ohlin model can answer that question by saying that international trade can occur even if the production processes are the same. Then where does the difference lie? The difference lies in Heckscher Ohlin model. So the Ricardian model basically is considering trade occurs due to difference in production function. So what does the Heckscher Ohlin model say? The Heckscher Ohlin model says that trade occurs due to differences in factor prices. Now what do I mean by that? Or not just factor prices, but rather factors. Let me write. The issue is about the factors of the two countries. What does it mean? Let's think about it this way. So suppose there are, let me use graph to explain. So this is the vertical axis and this is your horizontal axis. To draw this graph, we have to make some assumptions, or we can draw the graph and thereby draw conclusions from the assumptions, but let's start with the assumptions first. So let me consider the assumptions. Assume, let's say. So let me go back. Let me assume that there are two economies. Let's say, yeah, let's say there are two economies, A and B. And I assume that country A or economy A has more labor. So LA is greater than KA, right? And say economy B has more capital. So KB is more than KA, right? We can either assume this or we can draw conclusion from this. You can basically, there are two ways of thinking this. So basically they are two interchangeable, or like one implies the other and vice versa. So what are the two implications, or what is the next step? In economy A, labor is abundant. So we say A is labor abundant. Okay, this is a very important term. So you remember that A is labor abundant. I'm not saying A has to be labor abundant. Of course, you can consider the other way around. You can consider B to be labor abundant, but one economy is labor abundant. And the other economy is said to be capital abundant, right? And the other economy is said to be capital abundant. Now, what is the implication of this? One implication could be, a very popular idea is, if you have more of something, the price of that will lower. Very standard economic theory. So if you have more labor, that means wage of agricultural sector, the wage of labor wage rate in economy A, right? When you compare this wage rate with the wage rate in country B, say, don't you think this should be higher than this, right? Very standard assumption. So basically we can assume that if A is labor abundant and if B is capital abundant, then the wage rate in A is pretty low because the labor is high. Because labor is more, wage rate is low. And in B, because B is capital abundant, so capital is more, so interest rate is low. And in here, because labor is more, capital is less, so interest rate is less. Because labor is less in B, interest, not WA, or yeah, but maybe WA, you can say WA. Let me, no, not this is B, this is B, this is B, and this is B. WB is less because they have, WB is more because they have less, sorry, this is not K, this is LB. I made a lot of mistakes. Right. L B, right? So if any of you viewers notice this mistake, good job. Write down in the comment section below if you detected it before I found out this mistake. Good job. You're concentrating. Okay. So we realize that because country A is labor abundant, LA is high. This means this. So WA is low, K is low because LA is high, and RA is high. Right. This is the basic way in the two economies work. Now, let's forget about all economics. Let's think in a very simple way. What the Heckscher Ohlin model says is, again, okay, let's make another assumption. These were the assumptions based on the economies. These were the two assumptions on the economies of the countries. Now we will to make two assumptions on the two goods that are involved, right? So the two goods. So let me go back to the chart. We use two goods which are X and Y. We use two goods X and Y. Let's say X is a labor intensive good, right? So countries are abundant and goods are intensive. Let me write the total word, and let me write the total word here at least once so that we have a point of reference. So you have economies are abundant, goods are intensive. So let's say, this is an assumption, let's say X is labor intensive and Y is capital intensive. What is that supposed to mean? It means that X uses more labor. Think about the agricultural sector. Agricultural sector is very heavily dependent on labor, right? So you can think of agriculture as an example. You can think of manufacturing as an example. Manufacturing sector uses a lot of capital. It doesn't use that much. If you think of, say, for example, the AI industry. The AI industry is heavily capital dependent. It's a technological sector. It doesn't use that much labor. It literally doesn't use labor because it's an AI sector, right? So you can think of examples like that. So the manufacturing sector could be one example of a capital intensive sector, right? So these are basically the two goods or the two sectors of the economy. So this is one assumption. Now let's try to find out what this means without using any economic theory. Country A is labor abundant, so it has more of labor. If it has more of labor, suppose you're good in one subject. If you're good in one subject, it should mean that you will get more marks in that subject because you're more efficient in that subject. So if A is more labor abundant, isn't it likely that A will produce more X and less Y? If B is capital abundant and Y is capital intensive good, that means B has more capital and Y requires more capital. Y sector uses more capital and B already has more of it. So I know that B country knows that A has less capital. So I have more capital, I'll make more of Y. So B ends up making more Y and less X, or maybe even no X, and maybe A does not produce Y. What happens is, by the end of the day, A makes X, B makes Y, and then they exchange. And that is how trade occurs. So the difference between this and Ricardian model was the difference in production function, whereas in Heckscher Ohlin model, there's a difference in factors. So which factor is more in which economy and which commodity uses more of which factor, and that is basically the basic, very basic non-technical idea of the Heckscher Ohlin model.